Hi, everyone. We are now ready to start the presentation, and I will turn it over to MCN's Executive Director, John Pratt.
Thanks, Shannon. Good afternoon, and welcome to today's briefing on the Payroll Protection Program, or PPP, providing information on how nonprofit organizations can apply for a PPP forgivable loan. I'm John Pratt, Executive Director of the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and together with MCN's board and staff, we are organizing a series of tools and briefings to support nonprofit organizations during the pandemic. MCN's public policy staff and the Minnesota Budget Project are also working hard to make certain that nonprofits are included in legislative and funding responses, from the CARES Act and PPP to whatever stimulus or infrastructure package follows in phase 4 of the pandemic response. We will continue to sponsor weekly briefings with the governor's office over the next 2 weeks with several of the key commissioners and Governor Walz and Lieutenant Governor Flanagan. The payroll protection loans were an important part of the $2 trillion CARES Act signed into law just a week and a half ago. The goal is to keep people employed, but because this is such a new program and not all the details are completely clear even to the federal agencies administering the package, today we want to present two of the state's organizations that have been longtime financial resources to nonprofits and know nonprofit lending inside and out. Sunrise Banks and Propel Nonprofits are both organizations that have a long-time commitment and expertise. We'll be hearing from Kate Barr, President and CEO of Propel, and then Rick Beeson, Executive Vice President and Director of Business Development and Government Relations at Sunrise Banks in the Twin Cities. Thank you both for being available to be resources today. To begin, I'll turn it over to Shannon McCarville, MCN's Program Coordinator, for logistics and how the question and answer will work. Shannon?
Great, thanks, John. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation. Just click on the chat button, type it into the box and hit return. We will move to the question and answer portion later in the presentation, but you can send chats at any time. And now I will turn it over to Kate Barr from Propel Nonprofits.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you all for joining us today. Propel Nonprofits is really pleased to partner with Minnesota Council of Nonprofits for this, as well as many other activities that we do together. And we're really pleased that Rick Beeson was able to be available from Sunrise Banks to join us. Sunrise has really been helping to lead in the banking community on the implementation of this act, and I know many of you know Sunrise, so thank you, Rick, for joining us. What we're going to do today is we're going to really talk about the Paycheck Protection Program and how to apply. So Shannon, why don't you bring up the slides right now? So we're going to go through a set of slides for maybe about 15 minutes and really talk through an overview of the act and the program and what's included. Some of you I know are already pretty immersed in this and know it, but we're going to go through the key pieces, and then Rick will talk a little bit from the banking perspective on the application side and how that processing is working. I know that that's one of your primary questions, and then we'll have ample time for questions and answers. So Shannon, go on to the next question, please, or the next slide. Thanks. So the one thing that's good to keep in mind, just for context, is that the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, is a piece of the large CARES Act that was enacted a couple of weeks ago. This is the $2 trillion federal act that's the piece of the coronavirus relief that includes these components. There is the money to individuals, there's some funds for state and local government, and the small business is really the part that we're talking about. Go to the next slide. So the small business section of the CARES Act is this $377 billion that includes some emergency grants through the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, the EIDL program, which we're not going to talk about today, but I encourage you to look at it. That $10,000, it's a pretty simple process. The forgivable loans of the PPP that we will be talking about, and then there's some other things that are more specifically for small businesses, not nonprofits. But $350 billion of this amount is for this program, the PPP. Next slide. So the very big picture top line on the PPP is that this is available for small businesses, which in this case includes nonprofits. It is an SBA program, Small Business Administration, which is normally not available to nonprofits, but in this case it is, and we're really pleased that our national organizations got that advocacy done to include that. That it is a loan, but that it has this forgiveness feature that we'll talk about, that the business has to have been operational before February 15th, and there are some maximums, but it is a loan that is partially or fully forgivable. That's the important part that I know you're all paying attention to. So next slide. So I need to start at the top and say that Propel Nonprofits, while we are a lender, and many of you know us for our loan fund, among other things, we are not an SBA lender. So this is not a loan that we're able to make, but we have really become immersed in this and have talked to a lot of nonprofits, guiding them through this process. So the very first question is, who's eligible? 501c3 nonprofits, and then veterans organizations, C19s, with 500 and fewer employees. So if you are a 501c4 or a C6, that's an eligibility issue. It's the 501c3 nonprofits that are eligible, as well as small businesses are eligible, that are operational on February 15th, 2020. So brand new startups, you can't start up just to get this program. And importantly, had employees for who you paid salaries and payroll taxes or paid independent contractors. This is the eligibility question. Did you have employees or independent contractors? There are some exceptions, and for each of these provisions, there's probably an exception or two. I'm really going to focus on what are the basic components of it. And if you think that you have maybe an aspect of your organization that may be subject to an exception, that's worth pursuing probably with your bank. But these are the basic eligibility questions. Next slide. So big important question, how much money can you get through this program? The calculation, and I know that a lot of you know this, is all based on payroll. What has been the cost that you have paid over 12 months to pay people and the kind of closely related benefits, their health insurance, their retirement plan, state and local taxes. So what have you paid over a 12-month period of time? Payments to independent contractors is not included in this calculation. There had been an earlier interpretation that did include it. That is not included in the calculation in the final rule. So the maximum loan is 2.5 times your average payroll for the last 12 months. The 12-month period of time for the calculation can either be the most recent 12 months, or it can be the calendar year 2019. Either one of those two are acceptable periods for the calculation. So 2.5 times that. If there's something particularly seasonal about your payroll, there are some exceptions in an alternative way. The maximum loan is $10 million for this. So so next slide will show just an example of this calculation. So if you have a very simple annual payroll of $1.2 million, you divide it by 12, that's a $100,000 average. You can borrow $250,000 is the maximum loan that you can borrow. There is one particular thing that you have to factor in the calculation. If you have employees on your payroll that are paid over $100,000, the amount of their salary over $100,000 has to be excluded. Only the salary. This is another change from the interpretation from last week. But if you have people over 100,000, you have to, only 100,000 can be counted in there. But that's the basic calculation. So one of the most important things for you to do if you're preparing to apply for this is to get 12 months of good, accurate, complete payroll information and calculate this average payroll amount. Next slide. So the other really important question that has to do particularly with how do you get the loan forgivable, so this is step one, is how you use the proceeds of the loan. So you apply for 2.5 times your average payroll, you receive the loan proceeds, and what you need to do with them is over the 8 weeks after you originate the loan, after the loan starts, in those 8 weeks, you have to use those funds to pay payroll, including all of those very closely related benefits, health insurance, retirement. If you pay payroll, not independent contractors, but through payroll system, and you can pay rent, you can pay the interest on a mortgage, you can pay utilities, but at least 75% of it has to be spent on payroll. You could spend 100% of it on payroll or 93% of it on payroll, but at least 75% on payroll. But you are eligible to spend up to 25% on rent, interest on mortgage, and utilities, no other expenses in that 8 weeks period following the time that you get the loan. So that's how you are supposed to use the funds. So I know that one of the questions that has come up, if this is the requirement, is if you are in an organization where you've had to close for, you're really not really operating other than kind of keeping the organization in existence, but most of your employees have been furloughed because they don't have work to do because of the nature of the governor's order and the nature of the impact of COVID-19. So what do you do? Do you bring people back on payroll even though they don't have anything to do? Remember that the name of this program is the Paycheck Protection Program. So consider whether or not you could bring people back onto payroll and have them use this time for professional development, for learning, for team building. Are there other things that those people could do really that is kind of part of your organization? Because the whole purpose of this program is to get payroll paid to people. So how can you do that? Next slide. That was all really important because the question is, how do you get this loan forgiven so that you don't have to pay it back? That's probably the thing you want most. I know that's what we want for all of the nonprofits. All or most of this loan will be forgiven if you use those funds exactly the way we said for payroll and maybe up to 25% for those rent, interest on mortgage, and utilities. If, however, you reduce headcount, the number of employees, or how much they are paid by more than 25% during that period of time, then the amount of the loan that will be forgiven will be reduced. It's a proportional. It's not an all or nothing, but proportional. You will also be required to provide documentation that to demonstrate that you use the proceeds the way that we just talked about. So there will be an application for the forgiveness that will happen after at least 8 weeks after, and you will have to provide documentation. Unfortunately, the full guidelines on how to get the forgiveness have not yet been issued by the SBA, so we're waiting for those. Any amount that you have left that's not forgiven, so if you borrow that $250,000 and maybe $15,000 isn't forgivable, just because the timing of 2.5 months and 8 weeks obviously don't match up, then you will repay that amount as a loan over a 2-year period of time at 1% interest. It's unsecured, there's no guarantee. So as far as loans go, it's a pretty good loan. So, but the loan forgiveness is, I know, what everyone's really after. Next slide. So if you are going to apply, or if you have already been working on an application, this is the information basically that you will be asked to gather and put together. So you should be working on gathering this. There's the application itself, which is, we have a link later in this slide. It's on the Propel website. You can look it up on the SBA. It's in a number of places. You need the payroll